this title, Outsourcing the Hard Bits, I came up with this title when Alex asked me to come and speak before I'd really written the talk. So while I do orbit around this, I go off on some tangents as well. So just, could I get a quick show of hands? So obviously everyone here has an interest in computing and coding and music, but who would say that they're a composer, like a composer? Yeah, so good. So pretty much everybody. Yeah, that's cool. That's good. Great. Just curious about that. So again, I'm going to start quite a simple level. So you're probably going to think this is unbearably crude, but let's get cracking. So coding and technology in composition. Why do we want to use this at all in any way? There's a few things that are good about it, in my mind at least. Perhaps you'll disagree with all of this, perhaps not. But you know, it's consistent, it's rule-based. You can control it very precisely, and it doesn't make the same sort of choices that we make. Not currently, anyway. We may find out differently in a later talk. But yeah, so it can do things that we can't. It doesn't make the same judgment calls that we do, and you can use it to find things that you wouldn't come up with through purely taste-based choices. I could go into more detail there, but I'm not going to. So, and what's the difference between code and process, in my mind at least? So code can be, well, it's fixed for one thing. It's always going to produce results based on the same set of rules. It can be deterministic or probabilistic, though whether it's probabilistic or not, it's still following the rules. What's the difference between using an algorithm or using a process as a composer and using coding? Well, this is more subtle, I think, but any decision-making process is an algorithm. However we make a decision, we're still kind of using an algorithm. We can do that on paper. We can do it purely by taste. But if we're using code, we're computing it, which means there's a different approach to it. So when you're using process on paper, it can be slow, it can be laborious, it can take an extremely long time. From conception to realization can be a very long time, but if you're computing it, it essentially happens straight away. Even if you spend a long time writing the process, executing it is usually very quick. So that's the background of which I'm coming from. My own background, which Alex also talked a little bit about, is that I was at the University of York back in 2007, and the very first thing that happened to me when I was a fresh-faced 18-year-old and I came to the University of York was that this guy called Alex Harker says, "Hey, could you play oboe in this piece called Partielles," which I'd never heard of, which we just spoke about. But this was kind of a mind-blowing experience for me. If you all know Grisez Partielles, I'm sure almost everybody does. But if you don't, it's a kind of early masterpiece of computer-aided composition. It's this deconstruction of the acoustic sound of a trombone and the reorchestration of it. And it's absolutely incredible. And that kind of blew my mind as an 18-year-old, and from there it all went on. And so while I was at university, I did a lot of free improvisation, a lot of contemporary music performance, and I used a fair bit of PD, which we studied there. And that really took off during my PhD, where I did a lot of computer-aided composition and generating, things like that. So my PhD work used an awful lot of like stochastic realization of principles, and what it would do, I'd write a PD patch that would generate a piece. You know, I'm sure lots of people have done this before in other things. So I would write a PD patch and it would generate a lot of MIDI data, and then I would create a score from that MIDI data. And that worked really, really well. There's a lot you can do with that. One thing I did do from the technology side was PD doesn't have a great way by default of writing MIDI files in non-real time. So I built a little external which does that. So if anybody is interested in that, just give us a shout. Yeah, so these pieces that I was writing, they were realization of stochastic processes, kind of controlled fields of events. And so they're kind of heteromorphic, which means that, you know, if you ran the process 1,000 times, you get 1,000 different pieces, but all obeying the same envelopes, all with roughly the same characteristics. So, just to give a quick example of that, here's a piece, or a very, very short extract from a piece called Music for Miniature Landscapes, and this is for 4 guitars. I wrote this in 2014, so this just gives you a sense of where I'm coming from. Hopefully this is going to play. It does. sort of there. So you could probably hear, well, I don't know whether you could hear, but that bit of that piece is made from two really, really simple processes. There's a deterministic process where you get this arpeggiation, which becomes progressively prolated, and you have a statistical field of all the quarter tones in a certain span. And those two processes kind of overlap with each other in what I think is quite a nice way. But you're already running into some problems. I mean, if you look at this notation, you know, there's a kind of rhythmic precision here, which is clearly not designed to elicit the sense of rhythmic precision. It's designed to elicit a sense of rhythmic freedom, which I think you can hear. But for the players, I mean, they spent a really long time learning all these rhythms. And there's a certain disconnect there, I think, between the notation and the intention. So, you know, this is an example of the sort of envelopes that I was composing. So this is kind of like a space of MIDI notes, and then kind of expands, and you can control the characteristics of stuff that happen in various different parameters. So I was working with this parameterization. Here's a quick example of that sort of thing. This is a piece for 8 clarinets, 4 of which are detuned a quarter tone. Just a little bit of it. Yeah, so clearly there you can hear the opening of the envelopes and the kind of moving around and stuff like that, and controlling the different parameters. And that's all done in PD, mapping out the spaces of possibility and then letting these processes run. It outputs a lot of MIDI data, which I then write down for the instruments. So that's a kind of interesting thing to do. But I mean, as a performer, so I'm a performer as well as a composer, and I used to do a lot of free improvisation. Hi.
What was the year of that piece?
That was actually it was mid-2017.
Okay.
Yeah, I think. It was either mid-2017 or early 2018. Yeah. So so I also do a lot of free improvisation, and those pieces don't really sound like free improvisation. You know, there's an awful lot of fantastic instrumental sounds that improvisers produce, and rhythmic relationships and correspondences and interactions, which, frankly, I couldn't really write down. And I did try it. I tried to integrate this sort of instrumental practice into my own work, and had mixed success. So this is my problem. That you want to be able to access this incredibly rich sound world, how to go about it. So there's the kind of notational solutions that look like this. This was a piece of mine which I'm going to just go out there and say was not very successful at all. Because what I'm writing down here is kind of improvised gestures, like kind of a transcription of a physical improvisation on an instrument. You give this to some string players, it's a string quartet, violin, viola, cello, and they look at it and they're like, right, I'm going to try. But to accurately realize it would take them a huge amount of effort. When I improvised it, you know, without really any effort, I mean, artistic effort, but not kind of technical effort. And the act of kind of realizing that is incredibly difficult. Probably not worth it. Here's the truth. And here's another piece, and this one a little bit more straightforward. But here's a kind of oboe cadenza of course, written by an oboist. And again, this works, but unless you go on to write the whole piece like this, you have a problem. In that this acts as a kind of like maybe one moment that conforms to that kind of expanded instrumental technique, but unless you go on to write a really complicated instrumental technique-y piece, it's not going to really follow on. And Boulez has something to say about this. This is a book that came out in 2018. Well, the English translation came out in 2018, and it's full of contentious points. But this is a nice sentence, I think. And you've probably already read it, but I'm going to read it anyway. So the further we travel, as it were, from the centre to the periphery of the instrument, the warier we need to be of the autonomy of accidents, of superficial integration, of anecdotal vacuity. Nothing is more destructive to creativity than effects, because they easily become an alibi behind which their poverty of structure and lack of organic definition are apparent all too soon. So that's absolutely true of this piece, where this is kind of the only bit of the piece that sounds like this. And it sticks out, and it sounds great, it does sound great, but it doesn't really correspond in any meaningful way to what happens around it. So you have a problem. When Boulez says the centre of the instrument, he means standard instrumental technique. He means things that can be realised on lots of different instruments, the correspondences between the instruments that are generated by conventional notation. And when he says the periphery, he means breaking down that and, you know, yeah, and exploring things that are specific to instruments and do not fit well into the notated schemes. If someone's read that book, feel free to tell me I'm wrong. So I don't mind.
You're not wrong, he was.
Yeah, so the experiment that I wanted to do was to find a solution to this that worked for me. I mean, this is entirely about my own personal responses, so it doesn't matter whether you agree with me or not. So I wanted to find a solution to this problem which had a certain set of conditions. So to formalise what I call these local elements, the use of the instrument in this kind of exciting improvisatory way, shorthand, but I think you know what I mean, to control the instrument in a physical way. To not be bound by traditional rhythmic notation, that it's easy to read, that it doesn't look like that string quartet extract that I showed you before, so because I'm going to be playing it, or my close colleague's going to be playing it, and to be efficient, because what I don't want to do is to try something out, think, oh, this is going to take 9 months from conception to realization, and then at the end I think, well, that was a total waste of time. You know, I want to. This is just an experiment. I want to try out to find these things without wasting tons and tons of time. So the very first solution I came to, and this is not something I would ever show a performer, but I showed it to myself, and it looked like this. So this is for wind instrument. So I mean, I'm sure it'll be familiar to this sort of writing will be familiar to some of you. So you have this is the fingering chart for the instrument, and then this is dynamics, and then this is a parameter which corresponds to kind of like embouchure modulation. So at the top it would be kind of like extreme pressure, like distorted sound, and at the bottom perhaps underblowing, under-supported, and the middle is kind of normal. And I had a little pointer that would scroll across the top, because there's no rhythms here obviously, so the little pointer that scrolls across the top and tells you where you are. And this kind of produced some interesting sounding results, but obviously it's not that easy to read. You could just about do it with a bit of effort, but it's not great. Yes?
Straight away questions of contradictions.
Yes?
When you go forte and you're under supporting the embouchure,
Yeah.
are you going to get something?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you get a very, very loud, very, very flat note. On the oboe or the clarinet, for example. Okay. On the flute, you'll get...
So under supported is still supported, in the sense that you're still expecting a note to come out?
Oh, God, absolutely, yes.
Okay, so it's not like...
It's not like you've taken the instrument out of the mouth, no, not quite.
Okay.
Though you could, if you went perhaps down to about here,
that's
what would happen.
Legend note.
Legend lines, exactly, yeah.
Legend line,
yeah. So, but you raise an interesting point, which is that if you had it, say, at the top, and then you had a pianissimo dynamic, the sound may stop entirely. Yeah. But I guess you have to kind of set, as a performer or as a composer, you have to find the space within which you're deciding to work. And I think you can, by verbally explaining, you can describe exactly, or not exactly, but reasonably accurately how that might be done, and leaving enough to the performer so that they can integrate it into their own instrumental practice, but also defining that this sound at the top here is going to be extremely constricted and this sound at the bottom is going to be under-supported. So that was version 1, and it's not great. Version 2, Oh yeah, this was a piece for voice called hypoglossa, and this was marginally more successful. So you have exactly the same thing. You have, well, an articulated syllable, and then this line, black line, is pitch, and then the red line is the constriction. So with the voice, you can see how constriction might work. So to completely open. So at the bottom is kind of open down here, and at the top is very constricted. And then you have dynamics. The dynamics, of course, should be above the stave because it's a vocal piece, but they're not. So I'll play you a little bit of extract from how this notation sounded, and this worked quite well, with some problems, but it did work quite well. So that sound at the end there, that amazing vocal multiphonic, that's kind of someone's own personal technique responding to the kind of, that would be a very high note and a very high level of constriction, probably a pianissimo dynamic, and you get that, edge case sound. And this piece has been done by a male vocalist, it's been done by a female vocalist, and of course they sound utterly different, because different singer, different physiology, all of that stuff, but it's still very much recognizably the same piece. So on one level this is a success, because it manages to explore all of these edge case sounds. It manages to do it without relying on conventional rhythmic notation, and it's reasonably easy to read with a bit of practice, reasonably okay. I mean, you can improve this, because at the moment there's only one syllable, as you could hear, only one syllable per event. So you could put these syllable boxes all over the place and get much more interesting vocal stuff. I mean, again, it's just an experiment, really. So that led me to thinking, sorry, one sec. Oh yeah, okay, so the next step. So it's successful in some ways, but the next steps coming out of those two pieces is quite time consuming still from a compositional point of view. Actually not from a compositional point of view, because you press the button in PD, the piece is realised, it's done. But making the score in Sibelius is frankly a nightmare, because you're not doing things that Sibelius is designed to do. I mean, there's nothing in there that is kind of like basic Sibelius except for the dynamics, so it's not great. That takes a long time. So the piece is generated in PD, the score is done in Sibelius, and then it's re-imported into PD to put the scrolling arrow at the top. So it's not a very efficient process. So why not just do everything in PD? And that brings over to my next example. So this is the next stage wind notation, and this is getting a bit more interesting. So you still have this fingering diagram, but it's live now. This is a video. This is just a still image, and you have this scrolling, this coloured line, and the colour and the width indicate dynamic, and the height indicates again that from very constricted to very open space. And this worked actually pretty well. Just to show you a video of that in motion, so you get that sort of thing. And again, it's not incredibly easy to read, but once you get your head around it, it's not that bad actually, because you've got the live chart. So once you really get your head around reading that and keeping an eye on what's coming, I'm speaking as having performed it myself, it's not too bad. It's certainly better than that other option. Okay, and the other advantage of doing this all in PD is that you have knowledge to the millisecond of when the player is going to be playing and when they're not going to be playing, what fingering they're doing. All of that data is then available for you as a composer to do other things with. So live electronics. And here is a bit of an extract from that piece. This version for oboe and clarinet. I'm playing the oboe. A friend of mine called Will Ozard is playing the clarinet. Oops, that didn't work. Can I click on you? No. Okay, one sec. So, from a compositional point of view, it's completely, there's no content whatsoever. Everything is just a flat statistical space. There's no decision making on my part as to what fingerings happen when, because it's just a proof of concept. But what happens then is when the instrument's not playing, sometimes it's picked up by the computer and these samples are played back in simply controlled statistical processes. And what that means is that even though there's really no material in the piece at all, you do hear the most ear-catching samples come back, and you hear that kind of almost like a kind of emergent form there. So yeah, kind of interesting. That's another step in the process, but there are still massive problems with this. I do quite like the sounds that come out of this notation. It works quite well for some of the things that I was trying to achieve. But if you want to access what an instrumentalist has spent their life studying, that is the normal capabilities of the instrument, then it becomes impossible to write anything. So if you want to write, a B flat followed by an F sharp followed by an A, not that you necessarily would, but if you did want to do that, this is not the way to do it. This is a total failure at doing that. Yes.
Yeah, I was curious about that with the fingering and the kind of randomization element in the computer generated part. That how much of the is the computer taking account of what various fingers actually do? So, I mean, for example, does it know that this finger is way more important than?
Really, really good question. No, it does not. Not in this, because this.
They're just on and off, and they are.
Yeah. This was because this was purely a test of whether the notation was legible and so on like that. But that, you're right. That is absolutely the next logical step.
Like contingencies built into the.
Yeah, and now that this exists, this kind of tablature for the instrument, then you can build as many layers of that on top of it as you want, because you just write the algorithm and say, well, the thumb. If you're playing a flute piece and the thumb's off, everything's going to be a C sharp pretty much. So that becomes an important parameter, like whether the thumb is on or not. That's obviously a lot different to whether the little finger is on, which makes practically no difference. And then you want to create structures around that. Then now it becomes easy to do. Not that I've done it, but that's the next step. And the other thing that this allows you to do that I haven't done, but is really vital to it, is that if you have a piece for multiple instruments, you can create arbitrarily complicated rhythms for them, which then become relatively easy to perform. So if you want to have, 21 in the space of 5 in one part and 34 in the space of 6 in the other part, all they have to do is follow the notes. They don't have to count or anything. They don't have to work anything out. And the other problem with the really densely notated music that we were looking at before is that even when it's played really accurately, it still often has this kind of uncomfortable, concentrated, rhythmic awkwardness to it, which is not a universal, but I've found that to be a problem. So yeah, moving on. So this was the next step. You don't mind if I just keep PowerPoint up like that, do you? It's a bit easier. So this time we have a 5-line stave. We're assuming a treble clef for this. This is a 5-line stave, and now you have the pitches more conventionally notated, but you also have that other parameter, which is the dynamic and the technique modulation, however you want to describe it. And so now you've got a bit of a hodgepodge of the two. So you still have the rhythmic information encoded graphically, you have the physical control encoded graphically, but you also have the fingering now written out as pitches. These are fingered pitches, so they're not necessarily the pitches that are going to come out, which is an important distinction, but now you've accessed the instrumentalist's resources in a way that you hadn't done before. So if you give this to a player, they might be able to do it, but it's also not really playing to their strength, whereas this is somewhat more doing so. And also bring in the pitch notation. This is where the parameterization comes in that you could have done with the fingering that we were talking about, but I didn't. So this is the next piece in the thing in the selection of pieces, and these are all the parameters that are used to generate the piece. So this time the whole piece is still generated stochastically, but rather than being totally flat, this one has a form. And the form is just the kind of emergent summation of all of these different parameters. So these four deal with pitch, these four deal with rhythm, those four deal with modulation, so trills, color, dynamic, and that last one deals with electronics. So it's pretty simple. Focus is the center of the pitch band. Span is the width of the pitch band that the pitches can be selected from. Cluster spectrum ratio. Anyone want to give a guess on that? What that means? And Xpon at the bottom here is how tight the pitch band is. So at the very top it'll be just the one pitch. At the very bottom, or maybe it's the other way around, it'll be just the extremes of the pitch band. So if you've got the middle, somewhere in the middle, it'll be a kind of totally flat pitch band. And this gives this piece a lot more possible variation than the previous ones we've been looking at. Perhaps that's my own narrow-mindedness, is that as soon as I put those fingered pitches back in, suddenly, all these things occur. But they don't. You could have done this in the previous one as well. Yeah, so those are arrays. Right? They're arrays, yeah. And so what happens is they roll from 0 to 1,000, or from 0 to 999, and at any given point in the piece, the probability of a certain event happening is decided by an algorithm which just looks at all the different ones, or looks at all the relevant ones. So the chance of a note happening at this point, this certain point or whatever, is going to be decided by the note rest ratio, and then the length of that note is going to be decided by the minimum length plus the width, and also using the rhythmic exponent as well. So you generate a note of a certain length at a certain point based on this probability function. It's really simple, basically.
What about the horizontal scale? I mean, each point has like a millisecond stamp.
Yeah, broadly. I mean, it's a lot more than a millisecond probably, but the piece is about 6 minutes long, and there are 1,000 data points. So whatever 6 times 60 divided by 1,000 is.
It's equally divided.
Yeah, it just reads through them basically. So if I want a longer section, I just have a longer line basically. You could of course do it differently. You could have every event is read from the next point in the array, and that would create a different sort of process. But that's not the way I've done it here.
So it's roughly kind of a third of a second at that point.
I'll take your word for
That's
it.
what we keep him for.
Yeah.
Is there PostScript or SVG output, or do you primarily intend it to be an animated score for use inside of the platform that is design?
It's a good question. Basically, to be read as an animated score, I mean, you could. Were you talking whether it will be uploaded as an image?
Can you export like to PostScript or SVG, to edit? You
could do. I mean, that functionality exists within PD, not as a PostScript, but as an SVG. No, actually, no. I don't think you could. You could output as like a TIFF or something, but no, not as a vector graphic. And as you can see, the graphics I'm using are actually pretty crude. Yeah, really, really crude. I mean, it's not that you couldn't draw neat lines. It's because each one of these, it's because there's a resolution of like 100 data points across this, and each one of these is a vertical line of a certain height. So yeah, it would be, from a programming point of view, a bit more complicated to draw smooth lines. And what's the advantage of that? Perhaps there's an advantage. It looks better, yeah, it looks a lot better. Like Aaron, your scores produced in an Illustrator or whatever, they look absolutely astonishingly good. Yeah, they don't look like this.
Thanks.
But that's kind of almost not the point. I mean, it's legible. It's perfectly legible. It's like when, not comparing myself to Morton Feldman, but when Morton Feldman, someone asked him whether they could put a score of his in like an art exhibition. He was like, "Well, why do you want to do that? Like, what's the point? It's not to be looked at." Of course, they are all to be looked at, but not in an aesthetic way. That's a wider discussion we could have.
Can we hear it?
Yes, you can. So this is the opening. 2 oboes. the end? Yeah. So I think that's kind of successful, you know, it's accessing a lot of interesting things. Here's another example from somewhere in the middle of the piece, where the parameters are very, very different. So yeah, the cluster spectrum parameter was in a different point, as you can probably tell. So a kind of subsidiary idea that came out of this, and this is not really so much to do with improvisation, is that you can have control over these scores in real time. So if you've got this in your score, you've got your score that looks like this, an event here is not fixed. You know, it might be fixed in that parameterization graph, but it's not fixed until the player sees it. So that gives the possibility for live composition as well. So I wrote a piece called Narcissus for piano. And here's the piano version of this notation, and it's pretty simple. I mean, it's hard to read again, but makes simple sense. And what happens in this piece is you get a kind of bit of seed material, which in this case is 10 F sharps played in a row, and then it does a spectral analysis, and it then puts the spectral analysis into the notation, and then you play that, and then it does an analysis of that, and you get this kind of windowed composition, this kind of chain of links. And it works quite well as an installation. It has been played as a piece a couple of times. Unfortunately, I don't have any good documentation of that, so I can't play it back to you. It's going to be played again next year, or this year, in fact. But I do have quite a good computer realization of it, so I mean, not ideal, but let's have a look at that. I apologize if it's really loud. It's not. So 10 F sharps. You could do just one. You could do whatever you wanted. That's been analysed and it plays back. In a pretty harmonious harmonic series. Still pretty harmonious.
Are we hearing just the error of the analysis?
I guess you're hearing
Or are you
the
hearing
piano timbre kind of, well,
Because if the initial material is 10 quite separate
Yeah.
F sharps, why don't we just get the same thing every time?
because it's doing that's a good question, Alex. It's because what's happening is that those 10 F sharps happen within a window,
Right.
and then there's a spectral analysis done of that window as a single thing, and then it plays back the 20 strongest partials
Okay.
from that window. Sorry, I should have been clearer about
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So it's a single frame.
It's a single frame,
Analysis.
exactly, yeah. And then the whole performance, it becomes the next frame.
And the low pitches are just different stones or something that it's
All
imagining?
the unpitched parts of the piano action, or I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
probably,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah,
Yeah.
also
just like a
kind of-
thud.
Yeah, the thud.
Yeah.
And error as well,
Error,
because
yeah.
it's not perfect.
Yeah, cool.
And then also because it's playing
This
back
is interesting.
equal tempered. Okay. And then also because it's playing back equal tempered
Sure.
piano notes, it's going to accumulate error, and so you can see it gets generally more disharmonious as it goes through. Still on the F sharp here, but okay, so that one's pretty F sharp. Okay, but basically it gets less and less harmonious. And the structure of the piece is dead simple. It goes from the ascending arpeggio of the strongest to the weakest partial, and that kind of gets shuffled up, and then it turns around, and you have the weakest to the strongest partial.
Can we jump in sort of 2/3 of the way through?
Yeah, and that's where the interesting stuff starts happening. Actually, at the end, a really interesting thing happens, which is that you get this oscillation between an F dominant seventh and an A flat major chord. which really, I don't really understand why that's happening, but I'll just show you why that, I'll just show you what that looks like. So if we skip to about 3/4 of the way through. So you got that kind of strong F, E flat, and then quite a resolute A flat major. And you get that alternation between the two poles, which is really kind of interesting.
But it's a feedback process.
Yeah,
it
so
makes sense. As soon as you've
yeah.
got one coming in, it's going to be there in your window for the rest of the tune, and it will
Yeah.
reinforce itself.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
You say an A flat, but it's a G sharp. It's a ninth, which is very strong on piano.
Oh yeah,
In terms of timbre.
yeah, that's fair enough. And actually, the reason I think that comes up more than the fundamental is because it's going backwards. So the window actually is mostly full of the weak partials, and the song is only coming at the end. So that actually gives a preference to the weak partials. But obviously, it's quite difficult to play. So when you have a real pianist doing it, you have to play with the speed of the thing and how it's notated and stuff like that. But we did find quite a good solution for that in the end.
And what about the real sound of the piano? Because right now you have a synth, which is very dry.
Yeah.
But in the real
Yeah.
space, you have like the space resonance, you have the
Yeah.
speakers, and that. How does that change?
The result that we had was that it was just generally, it started off very, very, it was basically F for half the piece, F sharp for half the piece, and then it just disintegrated and just became kind of totally disharmonic, was the experience that we had. Yeah, but I really think it will be different every time. Different pianos, different spaces, different pianists. I mean, they play a lot of wrong notes, frankly, because it's generated in real time, and you could practice a lot and become very good at it. But they're going to play a wrong note, and that's if it's a significant wrong note that can change the course of the piece completely. There is one more piece I was going to look at. I think we've just about got time. So I was asked to write a piece for a large improvising ensemble, and the piece I came up with looked like this. So this is, you can see how the scores are kind of similar, but we've lost because they're improvisers, we've lost the pitches. I tried a version with pitches, but frankly it didn't work at all. So that's that. So what you've got still is the colour and the dynamic shown there. So the colour is obviously the instrumental technique. Dynamic is the width, and the pitch space from low to high. And I don't think I found the best solution here, but it is a solution. And what you have here is 3 soloists: this one, and this one, and then a kind of ripieno. So you've got the rest of the ensemble here, and then 3 soloists. And when they played this piece, it was incredibly exciting in performance. I mean, I don't think it necessarily survives as pure music. If I just put on the track on a CD now and made us listen to it, it would sound like a kind of reasonably interesting piece perhaps. But when you were there watching the score and watching them realise it and struggle with it, it was funny, it was exciting.
Were you projecting the score?
Yeah, the score was projected on a massive wall, okay. And then it was the audience, and then it was the ensemble around them. So the audience were very, very integrated into the reading process, which is not the idea that I had at the very beginning of all of this, that it was supposed to be a performance piece. But, you know, in this context, it actually made a huge difference. So just to clarify, the 3 soloists... Oh. You've got soprano saxophone, bass saxophone, oboe d'amore.
line is supposed to be the loudness.
Yeah.
And color?
And the color.
Colour is supposed to be from normal technique to distorted technique, and I thought as a group of free improvisers this would mean lots of multiphonics, lots of teeth on the reed, lots of crazy sounds. I think that parameter was basically ignored, but
How
But
many
even
ti-
time is roughly ignored.
time is yeah. I mean,
Stuff like
How much time had they spent with it before the gig?
about half an hour. That's why you need efficient composition. In fairness, they spent half an hour on everyone else's piece as well. So. So I mean that bit's straight up. I mean they're kind of copying the texture as a whole, but they're not trying to follow the individual impulses. They do get a lot better at that over the next few minutes. But rather than play the whole thing, I'm just going to skip to the end where they all play kind of together.